It is impossible to say exactly where the story of radio starts. The early scientists who saw and investigated the effects of electricity and magnetism were crucial to the story, but a number of people also noticed effects that were probably caused by radio waves. Did you know there were countless attempts on creating a complete radio? The evolution of radio took decades of restless nights and failed attempts. From a minor equation to a complete and advanced product, the Chronicles of Radio was finally complete. It was James Clerk Maxwell who first proved the existence of an electromagnetic wave. Much of this early work was performed while he was at King's College London. His work was summarized in a book entitled Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism. In a series of experiments started in 1887, Heinrich Hertz proved the physical existence of radio waves that Maxwell had shown to exist mathematically. His transmitter consisted of a simple spark gap across an induction coil with a loop of wire to act as an antenna. The receiver consisted of a smaller gap in a loop the same size as the transmitter. Whilst other people had seen the effect before, nobody had realized what they were, and Hertz is rightly credited with having discovered radio or Hertzian waves as they were called first. The coherer, an item used to detect the radio waves, took many years to develop, with the earliest observations dating back to 1850. The first person to use the idea of the coherer was a Frenchman named Edouard Branly. He discovered that the resistance of a glass tube filled with metal filings fell to 100 ohms when an electrical discharge occurred nearby. The filings could then be decohered by a sharp tap on a tube. These devices were effective in detecting the transmissions of a spark transmitter. The idea was popularized by Oliver Lodge, especially as a result of a lecture he gave in 1894. In the autumn of 1894, Marconi performed his first experiments with radio waves in the attic of his parents' house in Bologna. He managed to send signals over a distance of about 2 kilometers, and realizing the possibilities of the system for maritime communications, he gave a demonstration to the Italian authorities. 1897, Marconi demonstrates radio waves travel over water. Marconi gave his first public demonstrations in December 1896. One major use for radio could be in crossing stretches of water. Cables were expensive and very vulnerable. In 1899, Marconi steadily increased the range of his wireless system. This was the first international wireless transmission. Another demonstration was organized later in the year, and it was found that the signals from Rimuru could be heard back at Marconi's factory in Chelmsford, over 130 kilometers away. 1901, first transatlantic transmission. With the success in using radio waves to cross the English Channel, Marconi turned his eyes towards greater distances and being able to send messages across the Atlantic. Marconi started this venture by setting up stations at Polhu in Cornwall, England, and Cape Cod in Massachusetts.
Amateur radio came into being after radio wave proved to exist by Heinrich Hertz in 1888, were adapted into a communication system in 1890s by the Italian inventor Marconi. But here's the catch: radio communication was only possible via telegraph by using Morse code.
In 1906, Reginald Fessenden was the first to transmit a program of speech and music. He transmitted a first human voice over the radio from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, to ships in the Atlantic owned by the United Fruit Company. That was only one of the amazing things he accomplished with using the powers of a radio transmitter. By the early 1916s, the Marconi Company in England started the production of Hertz-ground radio transmitters and receivers which were used in the war over France. The first time airplane in flight communicated with each other directly via radio was on September 2, 1916. This marks the historic advancements in the world of aviation.
With the World War I, the importance of the radio became apparent and its usefulness increased significantly. During the war, the military used it almost exclusively, and it became an invaluable tool in sending and receiving messages to the armed forces in real time. without the need for a physical messenger.
In the 1920s, following the war, civilians began to purchase radio for private use. Across the US and Europe, broadcasting stations such as KTKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and England's British Broadcasting Company began to surface. KTKA would then become the first radio station officially licensed by the government. It was also Westinghouse which first began advertising sales of radios to the public. Where manufactured radios were finding their way into the mainstream, home-built radios receivers were a solution for some households. Only one company, AT&T, was able to toll and change broadcast. It was AT&T that in 1923 released the first radio advertisement. In the late 20s, CBS and NBC were created in response to AT&T being the sole station with rights to toll broadcasting. In Britain, radio broadcasts began in 1922 with the British Broadcasting Company or BBC in London. At this point, the radio and the BBC became the leading source for the public. In both the US and the UK, it also became the source of entertainment in which gathering in front of the radio as a family became a common occurrence in many households.
Golden Age of American Radio, a period of enduring generally from 1930 through the 1940s, when the mechanism of business broadcast radio developed into the texture of everyday life in the United States, giving news and amusements to a nation battling with financial depression and war. During American radio's golden age, much of the programming heard by listeners was controlled by advertising agencies, which conceived the shows, hired the talent and staff, and leased airtime and studio facilities from the radio networks. Projects got fixed in quarter-hour and half-hour hinders and highlighted a wide assortment of organizations. Glory Treasury shows united journalists such as Archibald MacLeish and Norman Corwin with entertainers from the real stage like Helen Hayes and Orson Welles, and film-based collection shows like the Lux Radio Theater and Academy Award Theater highlighted famous actors of the day pursuing live radio performance on their movie jobs. On radio's musical front, the National Broadcast Company set up its own symphony orchestra, driven by Italian director Arturo Toscanini, on live band remotes carried from ballrooms in New York City and Chicago. Big bands led by the likes of Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman, and Tommy Dorsey played popular dance music for listeners around the country. Programming turned political when President Franklin D. Roosevelt utilized radio to talk straightforwardly to Americans in his fireside visits.
In the early 1940s, World War catalyzed the growth of network news. Some programming were used for propaganda purpose, while other programs were aiming at keeping up the morale of the public. The war years clearly raised the profile of radio's role in society.
The final evolution of radio as we know today, the transistor radio, the Regency TR-1, is presented. During World War, two scientists and engineers at Bell Laboratories conducted research on many radar and radio devices. One goal was to find a replacement for fragile and energy-wasting vacuum tubes. Building on wartime research, John Bardeen and Walter Brattain, working with group leader William Shockley, developed a device they called a transistor. The first laboratory demonstration took place on 23 December 1947. Bell publicly announced the new invention on 30 June 1948. At first, the US military bought all the transistors Bell Labs could make, and the company agreed to license other manufacturers. As engineers learned how to use the new invention, plans were made for commercial products that could take advantage of the transistor's small size, energy efficiency, and rugged design. In 1953, hearing aids became the first commercial product to use transistors. Today, our cell phones, TVs, satellites, GPS, radar, self-driving vehicles, and endless other cutting-edge advances are made possible through the power of radios.